But I want to start with the broader perspective because we are living through such a significant shift in US foreign policy, and because some of the most important developments in European security over the last year have been those developments happening in Washington. The Trump administration's foreign policy, such as it is, does not seem to be the product of a strategic thought process. It's more like a collage of impulses, initiatives, slogans, and statements, not just by the president, but also by other senior administration officials. Many times, the policy vectors that we hear don't seem particularly compatible, and some of the leaders responsible for them, even if they work for the same president, don't seem to share a view of the world or of the US position in it. So it can be very hard to say what the Trump foreign policy is. It's much easier to say what it is not. And what it is not is a continuation of the foreign policy that has been at the center of Democratic and Republican administrations since the end of the Second World War. There has been a relatively stable consensus on strategic objectives of US foreign policy since 1945. Democrats and Republicans agreed that the United States had a strategic interest in building the durability of and avoiding the collapse of the international system. Democrats and Republicans agreed that we had both a moral and a strategic interest in seeing more people in more places living under rights-respecting democratic governments. Democrats and Republicans agreed that our transatlantic partnership with Europe was a foundation for achieving other objectives in the world. And since the end of the Cold War, and especially after 9/11, Democrats and Republicans agreed that the US should seek to lead global coalitions confronting global scourges, both because we want to share the burden and because we see coalitions as delivering superior and more lasting results. There have been differences in tactics from administration to administration, but on the whole, surprisingly few major gaps on strategy.
China's increasing turn to authoritarianism is of great concern, no question. At the same time, the core problem is that we have abandoned much of what made the US such an attractive beacon in earlier years. Rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, a welcome mat for international students and scholars. China is holding out the Belt and Road Initiative as a vision for its economic, political, and social model, and we're not offering anything comparatively compelling in return. Our success since World War II and our role as the indispensable nation was based on government programs that spurred investment in space, education, research, and engineering across a broad range of technologies. Our schools and immigration system drew brilliant minds from all over the world. A commitment to free trade boosted our economy.
The guy standing in front of you is someone who was actually paid a salary to travel around the world and discover what is going on in some other place in the world. They paid my flights, they paid my meals, my hotel, all those expenses of sending a TV crew around the world and so on and so forth. And it wasn't always because a bomb had gone off someplace or some crisis had emerged someplace. Sometimes it was the case that they actually just sent me out to say, Ralph, why don't you find out what's going on out there? Come back and tell us what's going on in the Middle East, And so you would do that. And ask yourself today, in this kind of a job environment or an employee environment in large news organizations, not even to mention smaller ones, who's going to pay that person to do that kind of, I'm going to call it spade work. It's not, I don't mean really gardening, but it is in a way kind of gardening. You develop sources, you learn the culture, you learn the politics, you learn about religion, you learn about food, you learn about all kinds of things in parts of the world which come to bear on stories you later report to the public and to diplomats and officials.
Trying to assist the African Union multilaterally to develop regional economic community-wide standards for business operations, which hopefully will evolve at some point to a continent-wide standard for doing business on the African continent, which I feel would greatly enhance the capacity for American business interests on the African continent, while at the same time build wealth on the African continent that is widespread. I've often said that it is a tragedy when U.S. business operates on the African continent. We create a few millionaires and a few billionaires, but we do not impact positively the multitude of people living in communities around the business interests that we have on the African continent. In fact, during the Clinton administration, I was the vice chair of the board of the American Committee on Africa, and I was on the other side of the government trying to force the Clinton administration to apply more pressure on oil interest on the African continent, to get oil interest on the African continent to have a social, ethical emphasis on the way they did business so that they would create the kind of wealth that will cause growth in African nations.
There are differing views on these two questions. And these differences are revealed in the differences between the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review and the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review that was just released. And each side of this debate points to science or the uncertainty about science to bolster their arguments, which are actually primarily political. And what we really have is a deadlock because of it's not scientists that are making these judgments, it's senators. And in particular, it needs to be 60 plus US senators who are ready to make these judgments, to say yes to both of these questions. And so far, we cannot achieve that. Our inability to resolve these science questions, therefore, prevents us from ratifying the treaty. And this absence of US ratification allows others to hide behind us and saying, well, why should we ratify unless and until the US ratifies? That includes China, Egypt, Iran, and Israel have yet to ratify the treaty. And until all of those four countries, on top of a whole bunch of others, including Russia and other countries, until that specified set of countries have all ratified, the treaty doesn't enter into force. And so in this case, we have an example where US policy is paralyzed over debates that purport to be around science, but also where we lose the ability to lead.
The Taliban simply are, or have been, things change. We all get in the habit of thinking things will remain the same, but the Taliban are a good example of how things change. When I first started following the Taliban, you couldn't find a picture of these guys. You couldn't get them on CDs. You couldn't get them on a video. Well, within months almost, they figured out the power of media, and now they're everywhere. The other thing they didn't do initially was want to be in government, didn't want voting. The idea of voting is non-Islamic to them. They think that voting is man taking away God's power. It's God's power to rule, not man's power to rule. Voting weighs into that somehow. That's kind of changed too. They're not as radical that way as they used to be. And the Haqqani group in this area have less to do with philosophic or religious activities than to do with straight power of Islam. I met old man Jalaluddin Haqqani years ago when he was still alive. He came into this lunch meeting. I had to cover up. He wouldn't meet with me unless I was covered up. And he had 5 guys behind him, so we know he's not a holy man, and they had bandoliers everywhere. They had 2 AK-47s on each of them. He was strapped, fully armored, and it looked as though he'd just gotten off the battlefield, which he'd gotten off of about a month earlier when he had taken Jalalabad. They didn't want to talk politics. They didn't want to talk values. They wanted to talk about the next war, where they were going to fight next.
Academics are not the only ones facing these issues. They are front and center as well for Hollywood, Apple, and even Disneyland. With China an increasingly valuable market for Hollywood films and co-productions more and more common, you're not likely to see movies about issues that China considers sensitive, especially the 3 T's of Taiwan, Tibet, and Tiananmen. I'm so glad that Ralph Begleiter brought up the Hollywood issue in films. I'm told that no Hollywood movie has cast China in a negative light since 1997. That was the year China condemned the movie 7 Years in Tibet for its positive portrayal of the Dalai Lama and retaliated for Kundun by banning Disney films and pulling Disney television cartoons. Disney, which was already in negotiations to build a theme park in Shanghai, later apologized for releasing the film. Now, the point is not that American viewers are suffering from being deprived of Chinese villains, but that a foreign government can determine the content of movies made in the US. Hollywood pays attention to the marketplace, as Ralph mentioned, with profits there further bolstered by the generous subsidies they receive for co-productions. Most of us don't even notice it's the dog that doesn't bark.
Unfortunately or fortunately, the people who created these social media networks have now begun to realize that what they thought might be the case when they created the technologies actually had dimensions to it that they hadn't anticipated. One of the founders of Twitter acknowledged that he thought if you just let everybody have their say, which is what Twitter is all about, everything would be good. The world would be a better place. And he now acknowledges, Evan Williams does, that he was wrong about that. One of the engineers at Instagram came to a similar epiphany recently in which he said, you know, we weren't even thinking about the idea that a product we were creating could actually hurt your life rather than helping it. We just didn't even think about that, right? And the CEO of Twitter in the last year has acknowledged that we just didn't fully predict or understand the real world consequences of the technology we created. Now, what are the real world consequences that he's talking about? Well, one of the real world consequences, and I'm guessing that at least some of you in this room who may have been involved in the intelligence community or had interactions with the intelligence community and national security and so on, some of you began to realize this earlier than others, and you thought, terrorists around the world are actually using these technologies in the same way that the Egyptians were using it to overthrow their government. The terrorists were using it to gather information, gather weaponry, gather money, and so on and so forth.
When Trump was elected, he said, the real America has seized power. Globalization has collapsed at its very center, right? And he is just ecstatic that we have this president. I'll just go back to my students at the university. I came in the day that Trump was elected, and they were in tears. And I was shocked, but they were in tears, and I think they understood more deeply than I did because they're way further out on the limb, right? One, the fate of their university was sealed, and two, the fate of the better Russia that they had hoped to build was now cut off in a single day. And in that moment, I understood the amazing moral authority that we had under Obama among these people. They had lost it, and they were in tears.
To the extent that the Trump administration has advanced a coherent foreign policy, it can be described as a mix of neo-tribalism, values-free deal-making, and isolationism. In this light, Mattis's defense strategy and its focus on positioning the U.S. for great power competition can be seen not only as a response to aggressive revisionism on the part of China and Russia, but also to the changes in our own foreign policy and the abandonment of an engaged and principled American leadership in building a more cooperative world. When the president is determined to roll us back to the 19th century, what is the Secretary of Defense to do? Of course, this is not the first isolationist moment in U.S. politics. Isolationism is a perennial temptation, but for as long as the United States itself remains a world power, isolationism will be a lousy strategy that leaves U.S. interests overseas vulnerable, produces suboptimal international decision-making, and erodes the rules-based order that we have built. There's a reason that isolationism so often accompanies domestic populism, for it is an example of the kind of false promise that populists use to hoodwink a frustrated populace into believing that there are easy solutions to their problems. As depressed as I am about the state of affairs today, I remain hopeful that we will correct course and return to a smart national security strategy and foreign policy. George Marshall and his contemporaries were uncommonly wise in seeing in the wake of the Second World War that even though we had become the most powerful country on earth, and in fact, especially because we had become the most powerful country on earth, the United States had an interest in building the institutions and laws that would constrain state behavior and make cooperation more possible and war less probable. The United States has interests and citizens in every corner of the world. There is no country with more at stake, with more to gain or more to lose.
A 2014 RAND study claimed that both the US and China share common global interests: stability, unimpeded trade, the maintenance and even strengthening of some multilateral institutions, avoidance of extremism, energy security, and control of nuclear weapons. However, taking into account this administration's recent moves, I'm not sure even this basic list stands up to the currents of 2018. With the man behind the book and movie Death by China serving as the White House trade advisor, unimpeded trade no longer looks like a common shared interest.
I find myself haunted as a historian of Russia and daunted as a citizen of the United States. Haunted because so many things we hoped were behind Russian history have now reemerged with a vengeance. And daunted as an American because so many things that we always ascribed to this alien culture of Russia have begun to emerge in our own political culture, as we all sort of know.
So these talks built on decades of US-Russian cooperation to destroy Russia's chemical weapons stocks under the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, a portion of which Cheryl mentioned in the introduction. And that scientific connectivity between the US and Russian scientists enabled a very collegial conversation about what we might need to do about chemicals in Syria. And that laid the foundation for the very rapid agreement that we and the Russians were able to reach after the August 2013 Ghouta attack that became the really key point when over 1,000 people were killed.
But going back to my first point, that Islam is not the Arab world. We should not look at Islam as it is defined for us by the Saudis, which we have a tendency to do. And supporting Muslim governments that are authoritarian undercuts every public diplomacy campaign for democracy. We right now have no envoy to the Muslim world. I'm not sure an envoy to the Muslim world is the best thing, but it's better than nothing.
Climate change cannot and will never be solved by a single nation trying to do multiple bilateral arrangements with the rest of the world. Climate change knows no boundaries or borders. If the water is bad in one place, eventually the water is going to be bad everywhere. If the sun is causing problems and drought in one place, eventually it will cause problems and drought in other places unless we unify to address the issues of climate change. How ridiculous it is for a single nation to think that it has the wisdom to withdraw from a worldwide decision on climate change and by itself solve the issues of climate change. Now well, there are terms that I would like to use, but I'm on tape, so I won't use that. If climate change issues are addressed successfully, it will require global efforts and multilateral engagement. Food security will never be solved by a single nation. Natural resource security requires global attention. The drying of Lake Chad, the decrease of snow on Mount Kilimanjaro, the absence of electrical generation and power in Ethiopia and other parts of the world, instability and fragility in Somalia and Sudan affects the entire world. America cannot go it alone. And if she thinks she can, it needs a psychiatrist.
Well, now we're talking about the journalism. How is journalism done? What is news, and what difference does it make? And the thing is, in the digital world, there's good news and bad news, and some of those good and bad things are identical. For example, the good news is the elite journalists like Ralph Begleiter, who get to stand on a television screen anywhere in the world and tell you what's going on, they're busted, baby. Ding dong, the witch is dead. Anybody can do this now, right? We don't have to listen to Begleiter. There's a little video clip of Hosni Mubarak, who was the former president of Egypt, who famously during the Gulf War period in 1991 told journalists that he needed to go in and watch CNN because he wanted to see what Ralph Begleiter was going to tell him about the war against Saddam in 1991. You don't need that anymore. Everybody is a journalist. Everybody has got a cell phone. Everybody's got that video camera and the still camera in the phone. Everybody is therefore a publisher. It's not just the hired hands at the news organizations who can publish. Everybody can publish. This is great news. It means everybody's voice can be heard in the world.
Meanwhile, the State Department is having a hard time keeping up. As I already mentioned, U.S. policy under the current administration has been open to sometimes differing interpretations. A fact sheet dated September 2017 on the State Department website almost could have been written in previous administrations, referencing climate change, human rights, and the 4 strategic dialogues. Although this is the first document that appeared when I checked the webpage of the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs, an office director I talked to in the Bureau seemed unaware of it, shrugging off the language as platitudes. Instead, the National Security Strategy, issued December 8, is the prevailing text, with its emphasis on bellicose wording. China and Russia are to blame for America's woes. Others point the finger of blame back at ourselves as in we have met the enemy and he is us. In the words of Ambassador Chaz Freeman, my favorite China watcher and diplomacy whisperer, influence within the current international state system is proportional to the investment, effort, and input made by its members. Those investments and inputs are coming now from China as well as India and other rising powers. Absent appropriate engagement, other values may well displace ours.
Now, this is all crazy ideology, but what if, as an official policy, they unleash chaos? Well, I think that's exactly what they're doing. Putin's in the catbird seat, right? You can say, oh, he's on the wrong side of the Sunni-Shiite divide here. He's siding with Assad and the Iranians. But all he had to do is stir the pot in Syria, and another 1 million refugees are thrown into Europe. This is what Budapest looked like a couple of years ago, which immediately triggers tremendous backlash responses. Stir the pot again, another 1 million refugees. They didn't flee to Russia, right? They fled to Europe. And then while I was there, they had a Russian conservative forum where they invited every right-wing, alt-right movement in Europe to Petersburg to sit down and talk about things, right? Marine Le Pen didn't come herself, but she sent a representative. And I thought to myself, this is really amazing. I've never seen all these people together in the same place. So the star of chaos, liberalism and reason are the ideology of the maritime cosmopolitan powers. They must be disrupted and resisted. Rome faced Carthage, and Russia will face the Atlanteans.
So given all that I've said, what do Muslim populations want? What do regular folks want? They've got all this to contend with, but in their lives, what do they want? And without sounding too Pollyannish about it, I'm going to suggest that they want peace, predictability, justice, social services. And why do I pick those? Because that's what they have accepted every time they've accepted a terrorist group in to rule them. Because their governments don't give them those things. And that, to me, is one of the biggest lessons for U.S. policy and U.S. values. If we support governments that don't give peace, predictability, justice, social services, then you can kind of expect those people to look elsewhere to get those things. Now, I'm talking about two people in particular. Afghanistan. Afghanistan gets Hamid Karzai as president, and then Ashraf Ghani. Did they get peace? Don't think so. Did they get predictability? Not much. And they certainly didn't get justice. Justice is usually the first one on this list, actually. Rural people tend to fight and kill each other over land, water, and women. Those are the things that any rural community needs taken care of quickly.
I want to say one last thing about the 2016 election, because there's understandably been a lot of reflection on what caused the moment that we're in. And for those of us who don't understand how somebody could have voted for somebody so manifestly unqualified for the presidency as Donald Trump, there's been a lot of soul searching of what we didn't see in our fellow citizens, because tens of millions of them did. And I think one of the concepts that I've returned to again and again as I've thought about it, and one that I don't think we spend as much time thinking about, is the concept of home. And by that I mean that a lot of our fellow citizens felt incredibly dislocated. They felt incredibly insecure. And if we go back to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you know, life and liberty get a lot of focus, and the pursuit of happiness is kind of that dangling third thing that we wonder whether Thomas Jefferson just wanted to have a list of 3 to make it look elegant. But the pursuit of happiness is really what makes it all worthwhile. The idea that we can create a society in which people feel safe enough and secure enough to be able to craft a life of their own choosing, that goes to the very essence of a sense of security and a sense of freedom. And I think we have to take seriously the fact that many of our fellow citizens felt that that feeling of being at home in the world, at home in their corner of the world, was fleeting and was disappearing. And I think when you look at the Trump campaign, which traded in, yes, a very crude form, but a form of nostalgia, a false promise that we could actually turn back the clock to a point in which people felt more secure and more at home. And when I say people, I mean white people, because that's who he was speaking to, and particularly white men. But the idea that we could turn back the clock, it was never true, but it was incredibly powerful. And I think that sense of nostalgia will be incredibly powerful going forward until we can figure out how to make people feel like the future is a place in which they can feel at home as well.
If we can collectively help reduce crisis in one part of the world, then it makes it much more easy for the rest of the world to exist with a sense of stability and a sense of comfort in order to do business and to have peaceful development. Whether multilateral diplomacy is used to establish partnerships, to create broad-based initiatives, or to resolve conflict, it is a powerful tool that augments established bilateral diplomacy. It provides the opportunity to join forces effectively, to apply resources efficiently, and to use expertise, moral weight, and insight collectively to maximize the benefits produced, thus greatly enhancing the successful implementation of highly complex arrangements. Multilateral diplomacy is never a replacement of the essential bilateral diplomatic engagements, which remain essential when nations are seeking to strengthen bonds of mutual interest. multilateral diplomatic engagement is an enhancement that recognizes that no nation can exist in isolation, operating on unilateral basis with its engagement with the world. Unilateral engagement is not sufficient in a multilateral, complex world as we have today. All nations exist as members of regional communities, as well as exist as members of the global community. Thus, national interests are logically connected with regional and global interests. Any nation, excluding no nation, any nation that seeks to return to a rigid, rugged national interest will find it difficult to survive in a world where borders, while significant, do not limit the movement of people or of ideas. No matter how strong an individual nation may be, no matter how strong its military may be, no matter how wealthy a nation may be, no individual nation on the face of the earth, including the United States of America, has the strength, the wisdom, the energy, or the capacity to survive in a vacuum. No nation can survive in a vacuum. No nation is good enough, strong enough, powerful enough, insightful enough, wise enough to survive in a vacuum. All of us need each other in order to make the world work as the world ought to work.